Welcome friends to this course on understanding absurdist drama. We are in week 1 and this is going to be lecture number 3 where we are going to discuss philosophical antecedents of the absurd, and today we'll discuss a major absurdist philosopher, Albert Camus. You remember in the last class we discussed Soren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre. In continuation of that, today we will familiarize ourselves with the major philosophical precepts of Camus. Camus was a French Algerian philosopher, writer and journalist who became one of the most prominent figures in 20th century existentialist thought, although he rejected the label of existentialism. Camus is best known for his works that explore the absurdity of human existence, the struggle against meaninglessness, and the moral questions raised by political and personal freedom. Some of the most important works by Camus include The Stranger, a novel that explores existential themes of absurdity, which focuses on the story of a character named Marceau, who is an absurdist hero and lives without any illusions of meaning. Another famous work by Camus was The Plague, which is set in the Algerian city of Oran and is an allegory of Nazi occupation of France during World War II. The most important philosophical work that we are going to discuss today is The Myth of Sisyphus. The Myth of Sisyphus was published in the year 1942. The Myth of Sisyphus recounts the story of Sisyphus, a figure from Greek mythology, and is centered around the theme of eternal punishment and futility. Sisyphus was the king of Ephyra and was notorious for his cunning and deceit. He often tricked the gods and used his wit to escape death. But this defiance ultimately led to his downfall. One of the most famous myths about Sisyphus involves his trickery against death itself. According to the myth, Sisyphus once managed to chain up the death or the god of death itself. This disruption angered the gods, especially Hades, the god of the underworld, who demanded the death to be released. Eventually, the god of war freed death and Sisyphus was ordered to die. Before his death, Sisyphus made another cunning move. He instructed his wife not to bury his body or perform the proper funeral rites. Once in the underworld, he used this oversight to convince Hades to allow him to return to the living world to chastise his wife. However, once back on the earth, Sisyphus refused to return to the underworld, living out his life in defiance of the god. As punishment for his trickery and defiance of the divine law of death, the gods condemned Sisyphus to an eternity of futile labor in the underworld. His eternal punishment was to roll a massive rock to the top of a mountain only to watch it roll back down every time he neared the summit. This endless, repetitive task symbolized the futility of his struggle against the gods and his inability to escape death. Now, you must have observed that Camus has positioned Sisyphus as an absurdist hero. He writes, and I quote, "The gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back of its own weight. They had thought, for some reason, that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor." Now, what one has to understand here? Sisyphus has been punished by gods. His punishment is that he will roll the rock to the top of the mountain, and the mountain top is slopy. The moment he reaches there, the rock will fall back to the ground. Now, don't you think so? This task is futile. The task that has been assigned to Sisyphus by the gods is futile, is worthless. There is no meaning in this task. And that's why it was considered to be a punishment by God. You can see, dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. You have to understand that human beings also perform the futile and hopeless labor every day. Every day when we wake up, we brush our teeth, We go to bathroom, we take our bath, we eat, we go to our offices, do the assigned work, then return in the evening, spend time with our family, go to bed, sleep. Next morning when we wake up, we do the same thing again. Next morning again, next morning again. So this monotonous, boring task of life we perform every day, is not that a punishment? Now the story of Sisyphus, all right, is an example in the sense that if repeating the same task again and again is a punishment, how can human beings make it that it does not remain a punishment anymore? And therefore, one has to understand that Sisyphus is an absurd hero because he transformed this punishment into something else which does not remain a punishment for Sisyphus. Camus has his own reasons for calling Sisyphus the absurd hero. He calls Sisyphus an absurdist hero because he remains the same through his passions and through his torture. He is indifferent. Bhagwan Krishna in Gita has said, Sukhe dukhe same kritva labha labho jaya jayo. One has to remain indifferent in sukh, in happiness, in dukh, in sorrow, labha labho, in profit, in alav, in loss, jaya jayo, in victory and in defeat. Only that person can be called sthit pragya, who remains the same in profit and loss, in victory and defeat, in happiness and sorrow. Now this is something that happens to Sisyphus. Sisyphus has been assigned the futile task of rolling the rock to the top of the mountain, but he does not consider it to be a torture. That's why he is an absurd hero. There are three more things that one has to understand in order to call Sisyphus an absurdist hero. First, his scorn of gods. You remember the story of Sisyphus I just told you? Sisyphus defies the commands of God. Sisyphus does not obey gods. Gods punish Sisyphus because Sisyphus has violated their norm. And therefore, Sisyphus is someone who does not believe into the authority of God. He believes that his life is in his own hands. He can regulate his life. He can control his life. Even if he is punished, his punishment does not remain a punishment to him because the way he thinks about it changes that punishment into something else. What is that something else? We'll discuss later. So first important feature of Sisyphus as an absurdist hero is that he scorns God, he mocks God, he does not believe into the tyranny of God. That is the first point. Then his hatred of death. Sisyphus does not want to die. Once he was into the world of death, but he returns. And when he returns, he does not want to go back. He wants to enjoy life. He wants to enjoy the sun. He wants to enjoy the moon. He wants to enjoy the river, the earth, the ocean, the pleasures of life. And therefore, like any absurdist hero, Sisyphus is not in love with death. Rather, Sisyphus is in love with life. Although he knows that life is meaningless, although he knows that life is purposeless, although he knows whatever he does is futile, hopeless labor, yet he enjoys that. And he enjoys that because of his hatred of death. And because he has hatred for death, he loves life, his passion for life. This is the third important feature. And because he loves life and he hates death, he is an absurdist hero. So I hope you remember these three features, three important points with regard to Sisyphus. 1, his scorn of God. 2, his hatred for death. And 3, his passion for life. Now, the story of Sisyphus provides us with an idea regarding absurdity. We have already discussed what is absurdity in our introductory class. We defined absurdity as meaninglessness, as purposelessness, as worthlessness of life, but we also attached some deeper, profounder meaning to the idea of absurdity. Now let us see how Camus defines absurdity. He says, the workman of today works every day in his life at the same task, and his fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. I have already told you how ordinary human beings live their ordinary lives. The same thing repeating again and again, like Shakespeare has famously said, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And finally, what comes out as the meaning of life? Shakespeare says in Macbeth, it is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So we have to understand that routine tasks, everyday tasks that we are performing again and again daily, they do not have any deeper, profounder philosophical meaning. And as a consequence, there are moments when we become conscious of the boredom, of monotony of our daily routines, of our daily lives. However, this monotony and boredom of life is not always tragic. Camus says it becomes tragic when the person who is experiencing it becomes conscious. So there are two things that you have to understand. One, what is absurd? Absurd is that which is meaningless. Absurd is that which is purposeless. Absurd is that without any inherent meaning. So absurd is something which lacks meaning, which lacks goal, which lacks purpose. But what is absurdity? Absurdity is a moment of consciousness. When the man becomes conscious that his life is meaningless, his life is worthless, his life is purposeless, then that moment becomes the moment of absurdity. Camus calls it consciousness of the absurd. He elaborates it, and I quote him, it is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. A face that toils so close to stones is already stone itself. I see that man going back down with a yet heavy measured step toward the torment of which he will never know the end. That hour like a breathing space which returns as surely as his suffering, that is the hour of consciousness. At each of those moments when he leaves his heights and gradually sinks towards the layers of the gods, he is superior to his fate, he is stronger than his rock. What one has to understand here? That Sisyphus becomes absurd not when he is struggling to roll the rock to the top of the mountain. The hour of consciousness in the life of Sisyphus is the moment of return. When Sisyphus is returning from the top of the mountain, he becomes conscious. He starts meditating upon the task that he has been performing, whether the task that he is performing is meaningful or it is meaningless. It is similar to us. When we are young, when we are youthful, we are not conscious of our lives, we are just living. But when we start growing older, we become conscious. We start realizing what is the meaning of life, what is the purpose of my existence, why was I born, whether my existence has any purpose or not. So the return is very significant according to Camus. What Camus is saying, that when Sisyphus is returning, there are moments of pause. The word pause is very important. You see, life becomes tragic when we start thinking about life. Suppose God has made me, whether God has given me any purpose or not. And if God has given me any purpose, what is that purpose? And whether I am fulfilling that purpose of God? Such ideas, such thoughts start coming to our mind. And when we go deeply into this idea, we realize that what we are doing is not something meaningful, because God might not have willed for us what we are doing, what we are performing. You understand what I am saying? One of the very famous novels about whom I mentioned in the introduction of this lecture is The Stranger or the Outsider. It is about a man called Marceau. Marceau is a clerk. He is bored of his daily routine life. Every day he goes to the office, every day he returns from the office. The same tasks he performs again and again. One day he comes to know that his mother is dead. He's scared to go to his boss and ask for leave. He goes to his village, but he does not want to see the face of his dead mother. What is the point of seeing the face of the dead mother who is already dead? He should drink black coffee as per the ritual, but he drinks white coffee. One day after the burial he returns. His girlfriend invites him to watch a film. He goes with her, watches a film, and that film is comedy, something which Marsa should not have done. The story progresses and Marsa is on the beach enjoying the heat of the sun, and suddenly an Arab comes and Marsa shoots him, and that man is dead. That man has no connection with Marsa, but Marsa has killed him. Later on he is sent to jail, and when he is asked why he murdered that Arab, that man, he says, due to the heat of the sun. Don't you think so? This reason for the murder seems absurd, seems meaningless. Why would someone kill someone for the heat of the sun, because of the heat of the sun? Now Marsa spends his time in jail. Initially he is disturbed, but after a few months or so he starts liking the jail. He gets used to the idea of jail. And his life in the jail does not remain a punishment. Later on he is to be hanged, and Marsa is hanged not because he murdered an Arab. Marsa is hanged because he did not cry on the death of his mother. It's a very interesting novel. Those of you who are interested, you can read this novel, and then you will understand that human life cannot be explained in rational terms. There are moments which happen, there are events which happen, which we cannot explain with reason, with rationality, with logic. And we also have to understand whether it is the story of the Sisyphus or it is the story of Marsa. It talks about the boredom that one experiences in life. That's why all human beings look for some kicks in life. There are, greater moments that we search for in our lives. We look for meaning through those greater moments. Like for example, the greater moments are we are born, then we go to school, then we get a job, then we get married, then we produce children, then we die. These are the greater moments. But what else we are doing in between these greater moments? Brushing our teeth, riding, cycling, playing, eating, defecating, farting, belching. All these moments are important or not. Whether they hold any significance or not, whether they hold any meaning or not, that becomes a very important question. And therefore you have to understand, when Sisyphus is returning, he is contemplating about his life, his punishment, about his existence, and that's why for Camus, pause becomes very significant. When Sisyphus is returning, focus of Camus is on the face of Sisyphus. He says, a face that toils so close to stones. You remember, you imagine how Sisyphus might have been rolling to the top of the mountain. Sisyphus might have been rolling rock to the top of the mountain like this. You imagine him struggling to roll the rock to the top of the mountain. Struggling Sisyphus. Sweating, struggling, sweating. And try to understand that rock is life. And Sisyphus is every man. You are Sisyphus, I am Sisyphus. And what we are doing, we are carrying that rock of life every day. Every day we are struggling. And then there are moments when we pause and then we think whether we are living happily or not, whether we should live this way or there is some other way we should live. That becomes a very important question. And there are moments when we become conscious, like the stone, like the rock, our face also becomes stone, indifferent expression. And we return with a heavy heart. And the return is also equally significant. Why? There is a possibility that Sisyphus might not return. Sisyphus might stop rolling the rock to the top of the mountain. But does Sisyphus not return? He returns. Despite knowing that the task he is doing is futile, the task that he is doing is hopeless task that he has been assigned to perform. But why he does so? He does so because Sisyphus proves that he is superior to his fate. God has condemned him. God has punished him. But he does not take his punishment as punishment. He believes in the autonomy of human soul. He believes that he has a choice, and with his choice, Sisyphus transforms his punishment into pleasure. His punishment does not remain punishment. Here we have to understand that there is a difference between sorrow and suffering. Sorrows are part of human life. There will be moments of sorrows. Something may happen to us which we may not like. We may grow old, we may die, someone else may die. There will be moments of sorrow. But whether we are suffering those sorrows or not, suffering is a choice. Sorrow is inevitable. Sorrow is inevitable, but suffering is our choice. Whether we are suffering or not, that is our choice. And that's what Sisyphus teaches us. Sisyphus has sorrow in his life, but he is not suffering. And that's what makes him an absurdist hero. And that's why you can say that Sisyphus's rebellion is rebellion against fate. It is rebellion against God. It is a revolt. Camus says about this aspect, and I quote, "If this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. Where would his torture be indeed, if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? The workman of today works every day in his life at the same task, and his fate is no less absurd. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent. The lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by the scorn." What Sisyphus is doing? Sisyphus is mocking his fate. Sisyphus is scorning gods. He does not believe that gods can punish him, that gods can torture him, because Sisyphus has erased the consciousness of suffering, consciousness of torture, the consciousness of pain. And that's why revolt of Sisyphus is revolt against gods. And therefore we have to understand that a truly absurdist hero will not bother about fate, will not bother about God. He or she would believe in the power of human mind or the power of human agency. Now, there is a possibility that some of us may argue that Sisyphus is unhappy, Sisyphus is suffering, he has been assigned that futile, hopeless labor, he has to roll that rock to the top of the mountain every day, again and again and again and again. And as a consequence, we may argue that Sisyphus is suffering. But Camus has other arguments. Camus has other interpretations. He says Sisyphus is an absurdist hero and therefore he is not suffering. Rather, he is happy. And therefore, he introduces the idea of happiness in absurd. He says, and I quote, "One does not discover the absurd without being tempted to write a manual of happiness. What? By such narrow ways? There is but one world, however. Happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. It would be a mistake to say that happiness necessarily springs from the absurd discovery. It happens as well that feeling of the absurd springs from happiness. I conclude that all is well," says Oedipus. And that remark is sacred. It echoes in the wild and limited universe of man. It teaches that all has not been exhausted. It drives out of this world a God who had come into it with dissatisfaction and a preference for futile suffering. It makes of fate a human matter which must be settled among men. Now there are 3-4 keywords that we need to focus on. First word is a manual of happiness. You see, how human beings live. Human beings living for or searching for happiness. All human life is a search for happiness. Whether you are living, I am living, or someone else is living. What we are searching for? We are searching for happiness. We make a list of items which can make us happy. We make a manual of happiness. I want this. If I have this, I'll be happy. If I have that, I'll be happy. Today I am not happy, but tomorrow I will be happy. That we do because we believe there is something which can make us happy. And that happiness is dependent upon satisfaction of desires in future. We look for happiness in future. And therefore, most of us suffer. Because we don't understand that happiness can be found only in the present moment. We can never be happy tomorrow. If we have to be happy, we have to be happy today itself. And the absurd is linked to the idea of happiness, because when we become conscious that life is meaningless, life is futile, life is worthless, whatever we become, whatever we achieve, whatever we accumulate, it is not going to make us happy. If we have this absurd consciousness, then we will be happy with whatever we have. Whether we have enough, we would be happy. Even if we have little, we would be happy. So our happiness in that case would not be dependent upon what we have or what we don't have. It would be dependent upon a perspective where we are living with, or rather without, any illusion to meaning. So to be an absurdist man or woman is to live without any illusion of meaning. And according to Camus, happiness and absurd, they are two sons of the same earth. A truly happy man would be an absurd man in the sense that he would know that whatever he is doing is futile, is worthless, yet he is doing it, and he would be doing it happily. So a truly happy man would understand the absurdity of life. Or otherwise, an absurdist man would also understand that each and every moment of life can be made meaningful, in other words, can be transformed into the moments of happiness. And that's why for Camus, philosophy of the absurd is not a pessimistic philosophy. It is not a philosophy of quietism. It is not a philosophy of despair. Basically, it is a philosophy wherein happiness springs from the realization that life is meaningless, yet I can make it happy. That's what Marceau does in the novel The Stranger or the Outsider. That's what Sisyphus does. He knows that he is suffering, yet he transforms his suffering into happiness. And it can be done only when we remember this famous slogan, which is all is well. My life has moments of sorrows. Even if my life has moments of difficulties, troubles, there are so many problems which are vexing my mind. Even in those moments of difficulty and problem, if I can say, like the famous Amir Khan says in the famous film Three Idiots, all is well, all is well, all is well. If we can say that, only then we can cultivate that aptitude or attitude of the absurdity. Now, we must ask ourselves, what is the meaning of the task that Sisyphus is performing? And by that logic, we should also ask, if all of us are doing or performing things which are meaningless, worthless, purposeless, why are we performing it? Why should not we die? Why should not we end our life if there is no meaning of life? And therefore, Camus has something very important to explain to us. Let us read what he is saying. He says, I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again, but Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rock. He concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Now this word is very important, this sentence is very important. Whether Sisyphus is happy or not, whether Sisyphus is suffering or not, that would depend upon how we look at Sisyphus. If we have pessimistic worldview, we would say Sisyphus is unhappy, he is doing something which he did not want to do. But if we are optimistic, what we would do? We would imagine that Sisyphus is happy. And the word imagine is very important here, because it tells us whether Sisyphus is happy or not, we must imagine that Sisyphus is happy. Because only when we imagine Sisyphus is happy, we can also imagine that we are happy, whether we are happy or not. So even if we are happy, or we are not happy, we have to imagine ourselves happy. And this is the core of absurdist philosophy. Absurdist philosophy is not tragic, it is not pessimistic, it is not a philosophy of quietism and despair. It is a philosophy that grants us hope. It is a philosophy which tells us that despite the meaninglessness of life, despite the purposelessness of life, we must live it happily. Even if we are suffering, we must cultivate the attitude and aptitude of absurdity, wherein we are the same through our torture and through our happiness, through sukha, through dukkha, through labha, through hani, through victory, through defeat. Thank you everyone. See you in the next lecture.